Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of Vivvi, I'm so happy to welcome you today. My name is Rachel Duda, and I'm the Vice President of Learning and a mom of 4 children. I'm really eager to dig into this topic today. Talking about race with my own children is something that continues to be a work in progress for me, even as an educator. And I could not be more excited to spend this time and learn from our guests today. Today, I'm joined by Tabitha St. Jacobs, a writer, activist, and anti-racism educator. She's one of the leading voices on anti-racist parenting and writes often about raising multiracial children in Parents, Good Housekeeping, and more. She also has a really valuable biweekly column on Romper called Raising Anti-Racist Kids, which I highly recommend checking out. Here at Vivvi, we believe it's our mission to support the whole family, not just with high quality learning and care, but also with education and resources for those early years. Experts say that racist bias can start as young as 6 months, and we know that parents' actions and conversations can have a really big impact. So we're so excited to have this conversation with Tabitha today and hopefully provide you with some takeaways for your own families. And of course, while I want to acknowledge that February is Black History Month, this is a conversation that we should be having year-round, and we'll be working to provide you with resources to have those conversations with your children. If you're not already familiar with Vivvi, I'm just going to give you a quick overview about who we are and what we do. Vivvi is on a mission to reinvent childcare and early learning for today's families. We currently have 5 campuses in New York City, including a new campus in Dumbo, Brooklyn. And we specialize in care for ages 6 weeks to 5 years old. We also partners with employers of all sizes to bring childcare and early learning for working parents as a benefit. Before we get started, I just wanted to share a few program logistics with all of you, and then we'll dive right in. First, I just want to say I appreciate you taking time to be with us here today. I know that you have a lot on your plates and are busy from the beginning of the day to the end. So I really am grateful that you were able to carve some time out to spend with us today. We'll have about 45 minutes together, and we'll use the first 30 minutes to run through a few slides and questions with Tabitha, and then we'll go and get some questions directly from all of you. We had some great questions submitted to us earlier, and we'll also take time to answer some questions live. We'll do our best to get to as much as we can, but this is a really big topic, and there is no way that we will cover everything in 45 minutes, but I promise you that you'll walk away with at least 1 or 2 practical tips that you can use right away and feel more equipped to handle whatever's ahead of you. Okay, so with that, let's dig in. I'm going to introduce Tabitha. Tabitha, if you want to add anything to my introduction, please feel free. If not, we'll jump right into the slides.
I think you did an amazing job, Rachel. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Okay, so let's dive into some of the questions. I'd like to start with talking about what is anti-racist parenting and how is that different from from not being racist? And why is this so important for parents and children who are even the youngest of ages?
Thank you, Rachel. Can we go to the next slide? I have a working definition of anti-racist parenting, and I do this work a lot with my parenting partner, Adam. So sometimes you'll hear me refer to we, and the we is really Adam and I. We're raising 2 children. Our son is 8 and our daughter is 3. So a lot of the teachings that we do with parents and caregivers across the country are based on both our experience as educators, but also real life things that we're doing with our children every day. So you'll see on the screen our definition of anti-racist parenting: parenting that intentionally and consistently infuses equity, joy, and social justice, centered on self-reflection, learning and unlearning, and community action. So a couple of things I want to stress about this working definition is that it's a practice. It's an ongoing journey. It's not a destination. It's something that needs to be worked on a continuous basis. And we also stress not just parents, but also the caregivers, because we know sometimes that kids are being raised by aunts and uncles and grandparents and so forth, who also have just a really profound impact on children's lives. And we also know that because anti-racism as a practice is steeped in really liberation for all communities that have been historically and are currently being marginalized, that includes communities like Latinx communities, Asian communities, Black communities, also Indigenous communities, and so many more. So as a result of that, it's not just white parents that need anti-racist parenting infused into their parenting practice. I can give you an example of myself. I'm not Afro-Latinx, but we make an intentional sort of effort to teach our children about the experiences of Afro-Latinx people who face a lot of discrimination in general communities at large, and also colorism within their own communities. And we know that these are important things to do, and we really educate our kids on these different experiences as well. And one other thing I wanted to point out about this definition is that you'll see that we capitalize the word joy. And it's really important to infuse joy in your anti-racist parenting practice, because liberation is based in a joyful practice. And even though anti-racism is phrased as in opposition to racism, it's the opposites of racism, racist practices, and so forth. There's joy in our anti-racist practice. And kids at a very young age, they really seek out joy in their lives. They really seek out celebration. They really seek out having a good time. And we really infuse joy in our anti-racist parenting practice. That's a really important part of it, leaning on the joy with kids. And what that can look like could be games, could be arts and crafts and so forth, which we do a lot of in our workshops with families. So that's a little bit about the general definition of anti-racist parenting. And then we also have a working definition for the building blocks of anti-racist parenting, which we'll talk about next. Should I jump into it, Rachel?
Yes, please do. Yes, thank you, Tabitha.
Okay, awesome. So the building blocks of anti-racist parenting, there are 6 sort of tenets to anti-racist parenting that have been defined over time through the work that I've done with parents across the country. The first one is continuous education. And we start off with this because it's important as parents and also caregivers to always be a student, to make sure that you're continuously unlearning things that so many of us have learned over time about racism, identity, race, slavery, and so forth, and really learning things that are centered around justice and equity. And we see there's an ongoing conversation in the news right now around book bans and around banning certain pieces of history from being taught in schools. So we know that over time, we've all had little bits of history omitted from what we've been taught in schools, and we've had different perspectives centered in our education, and have different other perspectives, like the perspectives around slavery and about Black identity and so forth. They've been sort of put as the second tier, or maybe omitted completely. So as parents, as adults, it's important for us to unlearn all of that and to really commit to learning about social justice and equity and so forth. And this is an ongoing process. It's something that we need to be engaged in all the time. And this can look like webinars, like what you're at right now. It can look like podcasts. It can look like workshops. It can look like books. Books are very important as well. And what you'll find is that the more that you unlearn and you learn and you grow, is the sharper your anti-racist lens will be, and the more you're able to sort of distinguish how to engage with your kids around this topic. The next one is consistent conversations, sticking with the conversations even when they're hard. Talking about race and racism with kids is very hard, especially with very young children. We want to raise them in an environment that's safe for them. But for many communities of color, it's really hard to raise children in places that are safe when there's things like police violence and tons of systemic racism and so forth. So consistent conversations are important. And even though they're hard, coming back to it over and over again. And one thing I want to stress about coming back to it over and over again is that this doesn't mean that because you're doing the unlearning and the learning that you're going to have all the answers. There will be times when you don't know what to say, when your kid asks you a question and you're completely stumped. And that's when you get to model humility for them. That's when you get to tell them, I don't know the answer to this, but let me find out more and come back to you with more information. And then actually go and do the research and come back to them when you have more information. So keep on coming back to it over and over again. The next one is reflective media, exposing kids to media that reflects our multiracial society. This, as I mentioned before, books, shows on television. This can also be video games when your kids get a little bit older, video games that they play. This can be podcasts and so forth, but really exposing kids to the reality of our society and that it's very multiracial and that it involves people from many different backgrounds. The next one is intentional environment, seeking out community activities that center anti-racism. And you all are based in a city that is rich in many different identities, many different activities and so forth that are going on all the time. And you can always seek out different activities that you can do with your kids to center anti-racism. Parents and caregiver modeling. So this is really important. And I think every parent and caregiver knows this, is that we are our kids' first teachers. If you're trying to teach your kid how to do something, then you know that they're gonna pay attention to what you're doing more than what you're actually saying. So think about how you are modeling anti-racism in your own life. How are you responding to the racism around you? How are you investing, as we spoke about earlier, in that continuous learning? How are you teaching them about social justice and equity as it shows up in your own life? Something that my partner and I learned very early on is that we're both very steeped in social justice work. And when our son was 2 years old, we learned that we had been talking a lot about social justice, kind of like around him. We had been talking about our work around him, but we weren't taking the time to be intentional about talking to him and really showing him how we were infusing social justice in our lives, not just in our work, but in our communities, in our family life, and so forth. So your kids are going to learn from you. They're going to learn from what you're doing more than what you're actually saying to them. And the last one is, of course, action in the community. So what this can look like is finding community and tackling the systems that uphold racism. And this can look like being involved with local organizations, local mutual aid funds, community centers, even just groups of people coming together that are organizing against racism, getting kids and families involved in those different activities, getting kids involved in those types of communities can be really, really powerful. And that's just sort of a working definition that my partner and I have around the building blocks of anti-racist parenting.
Thanks, Tabitha. And I really appreciate you saying that it's okay not to have all of the answers. Mm-hmm. And I know that a lot of parents kind of steer away from having these conversations because they don't want to give the wrong answer, or they don't want to say something that's not right. And I have that with my own children. So I really appreciate you saying that. And I know that a lot of the parents on our call today have young children, infants, toddlers, preschoolers. So how do we get started talking about race with children that are 3 years old, 2 years old, or even 1 year old? How do we start? And how does that conversation change as your children grow?
That's a really good question, Rachel. And I think it's something that you mentioned earlier about studies that have been done about how young kids are when they start noticing race around them, that kids as young as 6 months start noticing racial differences in the people that they interact with. And there's also been studies that show that kids start having questions about race. They start thinking about race way before many of the adults around them are really even introducing this topic to them in their lives. And it's not going to be effective with like a 1-year-old or a toddler to sit them down and to be like, okay, we're going to talk about white supremacy and racist systems. That's not going to be what's effective. So what's going to be effective is being mindful of your community, being mindful of the messages that you're sending them around what is normal around you, the people around you, the people that make up your friend circle, your family circle, and so forth. We talked a little bit about infusing joy a little while ago. It's so important to infuse joy through arts and crafts and games and so forth. One activity that my partner and I do in our workshops with kids is that we have a box of flesh-colored crayons, and we ask kids to actually identify their skin color from the box of crayons, and just starting to get them thinking about identity and race and skin color and so forth from a young age is really very important. And what's been interesting for us is that in one of our workshops, we had a little girl who picked a crayon that was actually very different from her skin color. And it wasn't the wrong crayon, but it was an opportunity for her parents to really start a conversation for her about how she was viewing her own racial identity. So these are always like very powerful tools to start conversations with kids. So really infusing joy through these things is super important. Doing it through things that kids are already interested in is also super important. We went to a trampoline park a couple of weeks ago, and because we've been having conversations with our 8-year-old for years now, he was able to look at a poster on the outside of the trampoline building and say, "Mom, there are only white people in that poster." So he was able to point that out to us. So looking at what's around you in your life that you can use as lessons for anti-racist parenting. And this can be television shows. You know, our kids we try to have them watch things like Karma's World and Spirit Rangers and so forth. But my daughter is like 3, and she just has been delving into an obsession with Frozen lately. And that's an opportunity to talk about the fact that most of the people on that in that movie have white skin. And what does that mean? And what does that mean for actors of color, for Black actors and so forth? And talking with our young kids about those things are also really important, but having those conversations with them while they're engaging with things that they already enjoy through television, through books and so forth, can also be ways to infuse anti-racism into the lives of young kids from a very young age.
Thank you. What are some specific tools that parents can use to start these conversations about race or introduce the concept of anti-racism to younger babies? How can we be more deliberate with our actions at home?
So I think like what we've been talking about and what we visited with the building blocks, a couple of things to do. You should use the public library is just like a wonderful resource for starting conversations about anti-racism and race with children. The Brooklyn Public Library actually has like book lists where you can click on a certain link and they give you a bunch of books to start conversations. One of my favorite books that we use in our work and also with our children is a book called Our Skin. And it comes in a board book as well. And it's designed in such a way where there's lessons for young kids where they learn about the history of race, where they learn about skin color and melanin and so forth. But it's also kind of interspersed with questions that you can ask your child. So it's an ongoing discussion with your child. So books are a great way. You don't have to go out there and spend money to buy books, although you should invest in these books for your own library at home. But you can go to the library and borrow these books with your kids and read them with your kids. We try to read to our kids every night, and we have a deal with my daughter where she gets to read one book about, Frozen, and then we get to read one book that we borrowed from the library that centers kids of color. And also one thing I want to note about borrowing books from the library that centers kids of color is making sure that the authors are also authors of color. There's been studies that show that in the book publishing industry for young kids, most of the authors of kids' books are white, and there are even white authors that are telling the stories of Black children in these books. And it's important to note that that's not ideal, because we can tell our own stories. And the reason that Black authors and also authors of color are not able to write as many books is because of a lack of access and opportunity, not because we don't have very rich stories that we want to tell. So books are a very good resource. I mentioned earlier, one of my favorite shows is Spirit Rangers, which is a show that's really good for kids from a super young age, from ages like 2, 3, 4. Even my son, who's 8, loves it. And it's written by Indigenous writers. It's created by an Indigenous creator, and it's also done in collaboration with local Indigenous leaders. They've gotten their blessing and so forth. So it's a book that really teaches a lot about Indigenous lessons and practices, but in a really like sort of fantastical way. There's a lot of fantasy. They're transforming into different characters and so forth. So it's something that kids can also really enjoy, but you can sit with them and you can talk through it with them and teach them lessons as they go along.
Thank you so much. One thing that I make sure that I have in my house for my children are the multicultural crayons and colored pencils and markers and construction paper. And those are something that, is available to my children when they're creating any kind of art. And I think that is something that parents can really think about adding to their collection of art materials, is that idea of multicultural art supplies. And it's a really easy thing to do.
Definitely. I see a comment in the chat to repeat the title of the book. It's Our Skin by Jessica Raleigh and Megan Madison. And it's at the Brooklyn Library, but it's also available in pretty much anywhere that you get your books.
Thank you. I want to go back to what I said before about how so many parents, especially white parents, are afraid of saying the wrong thing. And, that idea of like, I'm just not going to do it right. I don't want to mess anything up. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And what would you say to that, just to kind of put our mind a little bit more at ease and to kind of get us ready to start having these conversations?
I think that it's a completely normal feeling and sentiment to be worried about saying the wrong thing about anything with your child. It's completely normal to have questions about what to say, but I do want to point out that for parents of color like myself and many other parents of color, these conversations about race and racism and injustice and also anti-racism, we're having these conversations with our children really as a matter of survival, because we have to talk to our kids about things like police violence. We have to prepare our kids from racism in schools. We see studies that show that kids start to be adultified from a very young age, specifically kids of color, because of assumptions that are had around kids of color. So we're having these conversations with our kids from a very young age as a matter of survival. So it is a symptom of white privilege that white parents are sort of nervous about having these conversations and letting that hold them back from engaging with these conversations. And it's also a symptom of the societal pressure that's put on parents, where we feel like we have to be perfect, where we feel like we have to get it right every single time. And I really want to push back on that. And I want to encourage you, if you're listening, to really push back on that as well. And, I mentioned this earlier, to really model for your kids what humility looks like. That if you don't know the answer to something, if they come to you with a question and you don't know the answer, or maybe you want to broach a topic and you don't know the answer, to maybe saying, I want to talk about this with you, but let me go learn a little bit more and I'll come back to you on it. So modeling for them that you're also in a process of learning and growing, and that you're going to come back to them with some more information. So I think it's important to really, and then we go back to the importance of continuous learning yourself, because as you continue unlearning and learning, your anti-racist lens are going to be more attuned, and you're going to be more comfortable having these conversations in your life, because it's going to become more of a normal part of your life as a white person who's engaging, whether you're just reading the book for yourself or whether you're reading it in a book club or with your parenting partner, but practicing having these conversations on an ongoing basis, talking about race and anti-racism, so that with your kids, it comes a little bit more seamless. And it's really important to note that, I said this earlier, but like, you don't have to get it perfect. And there will be times when you mess up. Even myself, there are times when I mess up. There was an instance when my partner and I were talking to our son about a war that was happening. And my partner gave a really beautiful explanation, talking about the history and how race played a role in it, and how colonialism played a role in it. And we asked our son, so what did you learn from that? And he said, Dad, I have no idea what you just said. Your sentences were way too long. I don't remember anything you just said, and I have no clue what you're saying. So it's normal to make mistakes, and it's normal to learn from them. And what's most important is that you learn from them and you keep coming back to it with your kids. That sort of consistent communication that we mentioned earlier, not letting the times when you don't get it perfectly right stop you from continuing the conversations and the actions within your family.
Thank you. I hope that empowers everybody here today to, start having these conversations that are not easy to have. I want to share this picture with everybody, and I hope you could talk a little bit about it. I love it so much. Tell us about this photo.
So these are pictures of my daughter. So we hear sometimes that parents are nervous about taking kids to marches and protests and so forth. And I wanted to share this with you all. This is my daughter. On the left-hand side, you'll see she's 1 month old, and she was in Washington, D.C. for a protest that I was helping organize with the Women's March. And on the right-hand side, she's around 5 months old, and she's at the 2020 Women's March, helping actually lead the march. So I wanted to put forth these two pictures as an example for parents who are maybe thinking, I want to take my kids into community activities that have to do with social justice, marches and protests and so forth, but I'm nervous about it. I want to make sure that they're safe and so forth. And those are all things that, as a parent, you want to make sure that your kids are safe at all times. And there are ways that you can infuse these things into your kids' lives and still keep them safe. For instance, on the left-hand side, because I was busy organizing the march, my partner actually kept my daughter on the edge of the march because she was very young, and he wasn't sure whether he would have to leave very quickly to go change her, if she was crying or something. So he stayed on the edge of the crowd the entire time. And you'll see in the one on the right, she's at the front with me, but he's actually a little way on the side so he can take her from me if it became a little too overwhelming for her. So some things that you can do to make these experiences more fun for your kids is you can prep them for it. Many parents, if you're going to an amusement park or you're going to a special event or something, you prepare your kid ahead of time. So prepare your kid to go to a march or a protest. And what this can look like can be making a sign with them, getting out the arts and craft, the markers and the crayons and the glue, and helping them make a sign with you. Again, we're leaning away from perfection. We're going to lean into having fun and just being messy. And really make a sign with them, talk to them about why you're marching, what's the point of the march. We try to talk to our kids about marching because we want to help make the change that we want to see, because we want things to be fair for everybody. So that's why we're marching. Some things to also remember is to bring snacks, to bring a stroller. In 2017, when I was organizing the Women's March in Washington, we had a stroller brigade where we had parents who wanted to take part in the march, but there was a section for them where they can push their strollers along in the march. So if your kid is still pretty young, bring a stroller for them, bring snacks, maybe bring their favorite stuffy, Make sure they're dressed warm if it's in the cold. If it's a little bit warmer outside, make sure that they have layers on so they can take off if they get hot. And find ways to engage with them. They're not going to be at age 2 or 3, they're probably not gonna listen to all of the speeches and fully understand everything, but the experience of being there with other people, you can talk about, we're going to shout chants with everybody, and this is a way for us to be with our community and for us to push for the change that we want to see. And we actually noticed our son when he was pretty young. He started going to marches when he was around age 2, and he started like mouthing the chants with the crowd as well. So there's ways for kids to be involved in it. Again, going back to, even though you may be nervous, even though you may not have all the answers about what's going to be happening at the march and so forth, that it's still important to have your kids take part in it, to be a part of their community, and to be a part of making change, because kids have always been a part of social justice movements.
That's so powerful, giving children a voice. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to pose a scenario with you that I'm sure people on this call have experienced. I know that I've experienced it as a parent, and I would love for you to provide us with a short script of how we would handle a situation like this. So my 4-year-old, recently, we were on our way to school and we were stopped at the corner of the street, and we were waiting for the crossing guard to let us cross. And right next to another family, she said, that person's skin is really dark. And the other person heard, and it made me feel really uncomfortable. And I would love for you to provide us with a script on how you would respond in the moment to that situation, or a situation similar to that.
So a couple things to note before I share with you what I recommend a parent saying in that situation. I want to note that it's one thing to be able to have a script of what you're going to say, and it's another thing for you to, I keep going back over and over again. I'm like a broken record about the continuous learning that you're going to have that's going to make it more seamless for you. The more you educate yourself around racism and anti-racism and so forth. In that situation, I would say a couple things for you to think about as a parent or a caregiver is to distinguish what your child says. Is it something that is an observation, or is it a negative judgment? If it's an observation, like what you just said, Rachel, then your kid is observing skin color around them. They're observing race around them. And some things that you can say is, I noticed you made an observation about that person's skin color. Can you share a little bit more about that? Like, what made you make that observation? What were you thinking about? Really opening up a space to hear a little bit more about your child's perspective. I think an observation that is simply an observation can be a way for you to open conversation with your child. Now, if your kid says something that's racist, that's a negative judgment, the first thing you should do is address the harm that's being done with the person that's being harmed. And that can look like an apology, that can look like different things. But the first thing to do is to address the harm. And that also models for your child that when harm is done, the reparative work needs to happen. And then separately, you can have a conversation with your child to ask them some of the similar questions. I noticed that you said this. That wasn't a very kind thing to say. Can you tell me a little bit about why you said that? What were you thinking? Why do you think that was okay to say? So questions that are open-ended, that will open up the conversation some more. And that will also let your child know that they can come to you with questions and they can come to you with anything that they're struggling with when it comes to race. But distinguishing between an observation and a negative judgment is very important at the very beginning.
Great, thank you. And I would love to, I know we kind of touched on this a little bit throughout this conversation, but for a parent that hasn't yet had a conversation about race with their child, what's one way to get the conversation started?
So I recommended this book earlier. I love it a lot because it's a very good introductory book for talking to your kids about race. It's called Our Skin. It talks about the history of race, that race was actually created by white people. They talk about race as a construct, that race, even though it has real life consequences, is actually a made up thing. And it talks about melanin and so forth, and it actually has spaces. It actually tells you questions that you can ask your child as well. So if you've like never had any conversations with your kid about race, I would suggest going and buying Our Skin. It also comes in a board book, and using that book, sitting down with them when you have some time in a comfortable spot at home, and engaging with them with this book, reading this book to them, and using the book as a tool to really open up conversations with them. And one thing I want to note is that if you're having conversations with your kid for the first time about race, they may or may not respond to you in the way that you may be looking for. They may or may not have certain realizations about race. And we go back to keeping the conversation going, consistent conversations. So maybe you read a couple pages from Our Skin one day, and then you come back to it and really asking those open-ended questions so that you can really make sure that that you're leaving space to hear what your kid is experiencing as well when it comes to race. What's their perspective on race? Because kids are thinking about it. They may not have the language for it, but they're thinking about it already.
Great, thank you. I think we're ready for some questions. And Tabitha, we got quite a few questions over the last few days from people that are here today. And one of the questions that kind of came through quite frequently was this idea about how do you engage with your child's education and schooling, and then this idea about books that are being banned in schools and libraries. Can you talk a little bit about that with us, please?
Yes, I can. So I think a couple things. One is that your child's education is a collaboration between you and the school. For anybody that's gone through formal education in this country and in other countries as well, you'll know that there are like major gaps in education when it comes to teaching kids about slavery, about systemic racism, about police violence, and so forth. As parents now, as parents and also as caregivers now, it's important for us to also realize that there's a certain amount of education that we also need to do at home. So what we do is we buy banned books for our children, but it's not just limited to banned books, because I'll tell you about something that happened with one of my kids, is that, you know, many of you may have, for people who have older kids, may know that kids come home with book lists. And our kid came home with a book list one day, and we just decided to look up some of the authors of the books, and we realized that all of the authors in the book list were actually white. And if we didn't pay attention to that, then our kid would have been picking books from a selection of white authors, getting a perspective that was very white-centered when it came to his reading, and not including perspectives of authors of color featuring protagonists of color. So book bans are something that we need to pay attention to, but we also need to pay attention to the many other sort of insidious ways that the way that our kids are educated in this country may not always be as inclusive of all of the realities that need to be included. So as a parent, buy banned books for your children, read it to them, gift it to the kids around you, and engage with your kids about why these books are being banned. And also, you know, like we're in Black History Month, and I see a lot of folks, a lot of content on social media about, you know, the same Black role models over time. And while it's certainly important to learn about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and so forth, it's also important for us to teach our children about Black people in the here and now who are making changes in their lives and who are pushing for representation, who are having an impact folks like Nicholas Smith, who's a really incredible artist that my son is actually doing a Black History Month project on. So teaching our kids, so supplementing our kids' education with education at home. And this is especially important for me as a Black parent with Black multiracial children, to teach my kids about many different parts of their identity as well.
Thank you. One question that we had prior to having this conversation today, but also one that came through the chat just now, is that idea of adult learning. Mm-hmm. Can you share some of your favorite resources for adults? You mentioned podcasts and books, but are there specific ones that you would recommend to everybody today?
I think there are many different books that are out there. One of them that I am in the midst of reading right now is the 1619 Project. As somebody who didn't grow up in this country, I grew up in Trinidad. So my education is different from the education over here, even though the education over here is still greatly lacking. But the 1619 Project book is really, it's a really comprehensive book that really delves in deep and provides a framing for the world for the country that we actually live in today. So that's a really good book that I would suggest. And I know there's also a documentary right now. So there's different books out there I'd be happy to send along, to work with Vivvi on providing a list as well to parents, because there are many, many books out there. So you want to talk about race, there's How to Raise an Anti-Racist. There's a lot of books out there that you can start reading as an adult to sort of fine-tune your lens. So we can work on that together to send out to folks who have been a part of the webinar.
Thank you so much. That would be really useful. And I think we have time for one more question. And I'd like, one of the questions that came through was this idea about building pride in multiracial, intersectional identities. So this specific question was about, our son is Mexican, Black, and white, and has two moms. Can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Yeah. My family I am a Black immigrant, biracial woman. My ancestry is Afro-Caribbean and also Indo-Caribbean, and my parenting partner is a Jewish white man. So we're in a similar situation where our family's multiracial, multi-faith, and we're always having to be super intentional about a couple things. One, making sure that our kids don't feel like they have to choose one identity, that they are experiencing sort of a breadth of the different identities that make up who they are, and that we don't talk about identity as sort of a pie, to say like, I am half Black and I am half white, because we know that that's not how it's separated in our bodies and in our consciousness. So really teaching them that all of these identities make up the beautiful, brilliant person that they are, and it's all a part of it, and they should feel pride and joy in all of it. And some other things that we do is that we're super intentional about community with our children, making sure that they take part in like Diwali celebrations as much as possible, making sure that they take part in Passover and so forth, so that they're in community with people that are experiencing these cultures in a very significant way, and they sort of feel like it is their own because it is their own. And especially for me as an immigrant, it takes an extra intention because my kids aren't in Trinidad. So I have to put extra intention around infusing my culture into our home, because my kids are American. And that looks like, for us, that looks like playing music at home for them. That looks like finding books about different parts of their identity that they can read about and build pride and so forth, and talking about it on a consistent basis. I think that oftentimes, and this is something that I'm certainly really guilty of, is that life gets to be so busy. And sometimes, I just end up, for dinner, I'll cook the same thing. I'll cook the same foods for my kids that they eat all the time, the pizza and the chicken nuggets and so forth. And it takes extra intention for me to be like, okay, I'm going to cook like food that's actually culturally relevant, like pilau, which is like a rice and beans dish from Trinidad that I want to cook for my kids so that they can start to experience their culture in a multifaceted way. thinking about ways that we can be intentional about holidays and so forth. So there's really a wealth of opportunity out there for multiracial families to engage in many different ways. And it takes intention. It takes a little bit of extra work sometimes, but it's certainly possible to raise kids who feel a sense of pride and joy in the many different parts of that really make up who they are.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're at time, and there's so much more that we could talk about. But thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. And Tabitha, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us. We hope that you feel equipped to have conversations and to kind of address these subjects with your children. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for having me, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.